I'm Elliot Gerson with the Aspen Institute. I'm really thrilled to see what extraordinary response there has been to this. Let me just mention that given this response, we're thinking about doing similar kinds of programs in the future. Celebrations in the humanities. We could imagine something like this about Picasso or Bach, or a period in history, maybe Paris in the 20s or something like that. So if any of you think that that would be a great idea, as we're looking for interest and support, just please see me or see Jamie or see Kitty or see Peter, so we think about future programs similar to this. It is my great pleasure to moderate this panel with three of the remarkable people you've heard from over the last few days: Ross King, Gary Radke, and William Wallace. And the topic is Leonardo's legacy and the nature of his genius, which of course we have been discussing in many forms over the last few days. So Ross, let me start with you and the question of legacy. How do you think Leonardo's extraordinary observations contribute to our understanding today about the world and life on it, particularly when you consider that he wrote and thought 100 years before Galileo, 200 years before Newton, 400 years before Darwin, and of course because his notebooks were not really well understood during this period. So what is the legacy as we look at the world
Well,
today?
I mean, that is one of the very unfortunate things. It has always struck me as unfortunate that Leonardo was born in 1452.
He's getting it right.
I'm on the right centuries this morning. He was born at basically the same time as the printing press, and yet none of his works went to press. And I think we can maybe appreciate how difficult it would have been to print even his anatomical treatises, given what Bill Wallace showed us yesterday in the way that he did those. He would have needed a very, very good editor to get this into press. But maybe I'll just say something very quickly about the history of those manuscripts. As you heard, as Martin was saying yesterday, Francesco Melzi took possession of them when Leonardo died in 1519, and he was a very good curator of them, but of course, ultimately, they were dispersed. And Leonardo, as a scientist, was not really known in any meaningful way until the latter part of the 19th century. The first, I said yesterday, the first treatise of his that was ever published was nothing to do with the science. It was his treatise on painting from 1651, and it wasn't until 1797 that in France, in Paris, there were fragments of his scientific notebooks published. And we then take many more decades. It's the 1880s before any of his work is translated, either translated or published. It begins really in Germany with a man named Jean-Paul Richter, who in 1883 published in German and then in English all of the scientific notebooks, all of Leonardo's notebooks. And simultaneously, the French, beginning in the early 1880s and going until about 1900, began printing all of those. And so it was only by about 1900 that you, as a scholar, had access to all of this information. Galileo did not. And one of the huge missed opportunities of history is that Florence did become a scientific center in the century after Leonardo da Vinci. If the art dried up a little bit in the 1500s and 1600s, the science took over, first of all, because of Galileo in the early 1600s, and then in the decades following his death with his students and followers, who began one of the first experimental societies that actually predated the Royal Society in London of 1660. So these experimental scientists develop in Florence, based in the Palazzo Pitti on the south side of the Arno, with absolutely no knowledge of anything that Leonardo da Vinci had done scientifically. They knew nothing about his speculation about fossils, about what he said about the heart and so forth. They had no access to any of that. And so in some ways, his scientific legacy is much less than it could and should have been, because all of the things that developed over in the centuries following his death really developed away from him or without him.
So Gary, let's just continue on that line. What do you think got in the way of his insights being really fully embraced and understood in his own time, other than, of course, the fact that so many of the things he wrote were not available?
Well, I think actually they weren't available. Ross's point about the printing, and had Leonardo actually been able to, or took the time to get into the modern communication revolution, the engraving was developing to a point where if he had been willing to collaborate with someone, if he had felt that he ever had a work that was finished, it would have happened. So that definitely got in the way, because we've been talking a lot about that there are unfinished works. I've got a different way, I think, of sort of talking about these works. For Leonardo, these works were always works in progress. And I like progress, too, because every time he went back to them, there was always something that was going to be further learned that he could further add. So these are not unfinished in that they're supposed to ever be finished. And that's, of course, going to get in the way of letting your ideas out if you're not yet sure that you have solved or cracked the problem, and that you, in fact, even have defined the problem. For Leonardo, the problems just keep on getting bigger.
And what about, though, some of his apparent observations, and just the fact that he would dissect humans, he also looked at animals in a way that really verged on the heretical. So would that have been a problem as well?
Well, I think in some of the discussions, it's become clearer that it's not as heretical as earlier authors had said, that there were anatomical studies, that the body was important. Bill Cook made the important point about how relics throughout the Christian Middle Ages, you had the heart of Louis one place and body somewhere else. I think more it was that when Leonardo is doing these studies, he's just confronted with the enormity, and he redefines the problem, and it just keeps on getting bigger.
And I think if I could just make a distinction that people, when they get very excited about Leonardo da Vinci as a modern person, there should be a distinction between heresy, and I'm still not convinced that anything he did was heretical, insofar as though whenever he makes a statement about the soul, it was not for public consumption. I think he was thinking his way through things. We have to make a distinction between heresy and atheism, and he was not an atheist by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
And we have to remember that in the course of the Middle Ages, there were many very devout and believing Christians who were heretics. And St. Francis, had St. Francis been born 15 years earlier, he may have been burned at the stake in the year 1199 as a heretic.
Bill, let's get more specific about legacy. And what was his legacy to his famous contemporary, Michelangelo?
Well, thank you, Elliot, because Elliot gave me this in advance, and so I was able to think about this a little bit. Of course, Michelangelo and Leonardo are overlapping, and the legacy of Leonardo to Michelangelo was huge. Michelangelo would never have admitted it, but it was tremendous. And I thought about four things that were of real importance. The first one was that Michelangelo learned how to become a gentleman artist, like Leonardo. And this was tremendous. Everybody afterwards also wanted to become a gentleman artist and work for princes. And this became enormously important in subsequent centuries. The other thing is how to become multifaceted and succeed on multiple planes. And of course, we know that how Leonardo did that. Michelangelo did it by becoming a sculptor, painter, architect. He's really the best engineer of the Renaissance. Leonardo thought of everything, but Michelangelo actually did it. And Michelangelo was also a great poet. So he succeeded on 5 different areas. The other thing that Michelangelo learned from Leonardo, the third great thing, was that he could leave things unfinished, and it did not compromise his reputation. In fact, it could actually contribute to his reputation, that unfinished works could still be admired and people would still think of them as potentially in progress, and that they would contribute nonetheless to his reputation. And then the last thing is that he really built a reputation and a career on very few works. Michelangelo did not actually finish or make a huge number of objects, nor did Leonardo, and yet we consider them some of the greatest artists of all time.
Let's just talk a little bit about genius in the context of being a polymath. I mean, they were both Renaissance men, and as you said, Michelangelo was more than a consummate sculptor, and he had all these other interests. Does that mean genius in the arts has to involve those multi-dimensions? I mean, what about Bach? I mean, he didn't even write opera, so leaving aside his focus on music. Or Picasso, a genius, but not a scientist. Shakespeare, a genius, but not a scientist. What is different about those kinds of genius?
No, I think genius can't be pinned down. There are so multiple ways of being a genius. I think Michelangelo learned from Leonardo one way to be a genius, which was to be multifaceted and to accomplish great things by being gargantuan, to be ambitious. But yes, exactly right. Mozart, Shakespeare, these are geniuses in different ways.
Yeah,
So,
I'd add to that I think Leonardo taught a lot of people that to be a genius, you had to work hard. It's not easy work being a genius. Today we say if you really want to master something, you need to work on it for 10,000 hours. That's the equivalent of a PhD. That's 5 years working 40 hours a week on something. And that's, I mean, Leonardo is really teaching us that genius, you may have it, but to realize it, and whether you choose that you're going to do it musically or you're going to do it in multiple ways, you better keep at it. And there was the man who did the midnight oil more than anybody else was Michelangelo, doing his accounts even after he worked all day. Leonardo, obviously not a moment that he's not thinking and writing something.
Well, Gary, let's just stay and think about legacy on someone else, same time but younger, and Raphael.
Oh yeah,
and a younger contemporary of both. What kind of legacy did Leonardo have on Raphael's genius?
Right. The legacy for Raphael is really a fascinating one, because I think it does show us where, unlike the scientific texts, there were works of art that artists could look at. They did not have to read the treatise on painting necessarily to have looked carefully in early versions of the Mona Lisa. And Raphael then does portraits of Maddalena Strozzi, and she's sitting there and it's got the perfect pose. He goes and does a portrait of the great courtier Baldassare Castiglione, and it's basically a male Mona Lisa. It has that sense of, that there is thinking in the eyes, that there is a person there. And certainly late in his life, unfortunately for Raphael, he dies when he's in his late 30s, so it's not very late, truly just a year after Leonardo. He begins to look carefully at Leonardo and realizes the dramatic light and shade for his famous Transfiguration can really transform and make Leonardo's vision on a grand scale and be preserved in an altarpiece that we respect still today.
And he's the greatest narrative painter of all time.
Exactly. and that narration is something that comes out of Leonardo telling us to tell a good story.
Yeah.
Ross, let's now turn a little bit to the nature of genius, which is something that fascinates everyone. And what significance, and we've talked about this a little bit here, but what significance do you attribute to the fact that Leonardo did not receive much formal education?
It helped him and hindered him. I think he himself would have been somewhat defensive about his lack of education. He called himself an uomo senza lettere, essentially a man without letters, an unlettered individual, which didn't mean, of course, that he was illiterate, because he obviously could read. But what he meant is, he called himself a disciple of experience. And he said that rather than reading treatises on what, just as I was talking yesterday about the way Leonardo said, you do not look at other paintings to make your painting. You look at real life, you look at nature. In order to write about nature, you didn't read other books about nature, so he said. Instead, what you did was you studied nature and looked at it through experience. That was his official story, and there's absolutely no question that he looked at nature and investigated things much more closely than anyone previously. But he was not, of course, going to cut himself off from a very rich and useful intellectual tradition. And I one time went through all of his writings to try to find all of the classical authors and all of the 14th, 15th century authors that he quotes or mentions, or whose books he says he wants to find, because his notebooks are full of things saying that this stationer has this copy of Vitruvius, or here is Giacomo Andrea's copy, and so forth. And so he's trying, and he built up a library of over 100 books. So he was not simply a disciple of experience, he was someone who wanted to have book learning as well, because it would have been foolish not to see what questions were posed and what solutions had been offered to many of the things that he was looking at. And so he was very interested in that. But yes, he lacked a formal education, and crucially, he lacked Latin. And so when he said he was a man without letters, what he really meant is he didn't know Latin. I made a study of his books and found that he owned 6 elementary Latin grammars. And so I think for anyone who has ever, and he copied out Latin words and declensions, things like that, and he was clearly in his 30s trying to teach himself Latin. And so because he would have gone to an abacus school where he would have learned mathematics for merchants, he would not have gone to a school because of the fact he was not going to become a priest or a notary as illegitimate, so he did not need Latin, it was felt, and so he just simply went to an abacus school. And in his 30s, he decided to make up this intellectual deficit by learning Latin. And so anyone who's ever taken a Pimsleur course or Rosetta Stone or taken a night class in French, Spanish, Italian, think of Leonardo da Vinci trying to learn amo, amas, amat at age 38. I mean, there's something very, very humbling and I think very endearing about him doing that. And in fact, he never became all that adept at Latin. Just the last point I'd like to make about him as a disciple of experience versus book learning. One of the fascinating things that he did that I think shows that he didn't always practice what he preached is that when he did his dissections of the heart, he had a copy of Galen, who was the great Roman physician, next to him. And he wanted to know how the blood moved around in the heart. Leonardo, as you probably know, did not know about the circulation of the blood. It would be 1628 before that arrived. And I emphasize 1628. So over a century after Leonardo's death. But he wanted to know how the blood moved within the heart because they knew it moved within systems in the body. And Galen said that it moved from the right ventricle to the left through the septum, this wall, through a series of pores. And so Leonardo, when he dissected the heart, and there aren't pores in the septum, it is completely solid. And so blood could not have moved back and forth. And Leonardo, dissecting hearts, would have seen that Galen was wrong, and yet he did not cross him. And so in his diagrams, one of the diagrams in Windsor Castle, where all the great anatomical drawings are, he put pores into the septum. He makes it porous, and he actually writes, he has a quotation from Galen describing that. And so he could not see those pores with his eyes. They did not and do not exist, and yet he didn't cross Galen. And just in his defense, someone who is probably at least as good an anatomist as him coming a couple of generations later, the great Flemish anatomist Andreas Vesalius did exactly the same thing. And Vesalius even makes a note where he says, basically, I mean, in so many words, he's saying, I don't understand how the Creator has done this, making these invisible pores through which the blood can go. Right. So Leonardo was a disciple of experience. He looked very closely, but he also paid attention to what people like Galen said.
Bill, did you have a quick comment?
Leonardo had 116 books. Rembrandt had 22 books. Caravaggio had 12.
Oh, probably of dubious.
Let's talk about another aspect of genius. I think many times people have this idea of sort of a divine spark or an extraordinary talent that lives in isolation and thinks in isolation. How important is community and collaboration? Or another way of looking at this, how important is the intellectual ferment of Florence? We've talked about this at the time. And then you think about, I mentioned like Paris in the 20s, or you could talk about Athens. You could talk even about Paris during the Great Impressionist period. How important is it for the combination of this extraordinary natural talent to be in an environment that is conducive and with similar spirits and activity? Any of you?
Can you imagine, Leonardo, I said that for talent, you really need to put in the time, but you also have to have things that help to bring out that talent, to challenge you to do it. And I'm sure he would have been brilliant had he stayed in Vinci, and he would have been the local person who knew more about every little rock and every little flower that was there. But by being in Florence, where there was both application, there was going to be people who wanted to know things, who wanted to portray things, people who were just interested in conversation. It's really important. People say, early reports, that Leonardo was a very good conversationalist, that he was interested in hearing from one another. The only thing I find odd about Leonardo myself is that he is so busy learning about the world outside himself that he doesn't tell us very much about himself. But that maybe helps him to push forward in all those explorations, and it's the community that he's talking to.
And I'm really a scholar of Michelangelo, and for 40 years I've been writing about trying to take an artist who has been generally written about in isolation, as if he did everything by himself. And my very first book was The Artist as Entrepreneur. He was a great business organizer, a great entrepreneur. He could not have accomplished what he had accomplished without being surrounded by brilliant individuals who he was very good at organizing and creating in collaboration with. He is a brilliant organizer of other people's talents.
Let me just stay with you, Bill. I think it was you who said yesterday about scale and ambition as being critical to genius. And I just was thinking about that and thinking, well, what about someone like Vermeer, who did very little? Does that make his genius less? I mean, how important is it really? I mean, to have that ambition and accomplish a great deal.
It's a very good question.
And again, his art wasn't even appreciated during his lifetime.
Very good question. I put scale and ambition as a part of the definition of the genius that we were defining here among the Leonardo and the Renaissance part of Florence and the Italian Renaissance. Vermeer, I would have to redefine my definition of genius very much, because I do think there are tiny geniuses. There are the Joseph Cornells. Who build tiny boxes and who probably nobody knew about in their lifetime. I think there are multiple different kinds of geniuses. So I would have to completely redefine my words to define the geniuses of a Vermeer.
I think, therefore, we have to be careful to not assume that genius is only these grand things, that there's probably plenty of you geniuses out there, people who have very, very special ways that you have learned things or thought about things, and that we need to, in fact, why do we treasure having multiple friends? Because everyone has a different set of experiences, and all of a sudden you're at somebody's dinner party and you're learning more than you ever wanted to learn about their latest obsession, but that obsession is something where the genius of their own interest and seeing the world comes together, I think.
Yeah, I mean, genius is not a matter of quantity, it's a matter of quality. And so I would argue the great American novelist, or the great American novel, I think, is The Great Gatsby. And Fitzgerald arguably did not, it's 180 pages long, and arguably Fitzgerald wrote nothing else that came close to that. And yet that is a genius of a book.
And we could also think of examples of great works of genius that, unlike, you're talking about working hard, almost sort of a Calvinist ethic, that a concerto written in hours or something like that.
Sure. When we think of the young Mozart, there certainly is there prodigy geniuses, but I think we really go astray when we only assume that it has to be the prodigy, that it comes from above, and that then it just gets done. It's both above, and Mozart was busy composing.
There are longitudinal studies on creativity, which I think probably would make depressing reading for most of us in this room. That there's an economist at the University of Chicago who has looked at prices for which paintings by French artists of the 19th century, how much they have fetched at auction, which is an odd way of defining quality, because often there's not that strong a link between the market price of something and whether or not it is extremely good. But what he found is that the crucial age is 37. That's the point at which the value goes for the most. In one of the earliest longitudinal studies, said the 30s is the golden decade, the 40s the silver decade, and the 70s is the wooden decade. Which is something I've been thinking about a lot, because my most recent book, just to do a pitch for it, is on Claude Monet from ages 74 to 86, and Bill working on...
And I just wrote a book on Michelangelo in his 70s and 80s. He was busier and better than ever. So we're just entering our best years.
So they're great examples.
Thank goodness for that.
Leonardo, let's give Leonardo some credit here. I mean, Leonardo, I mean, it is interesting how these kinds of definitions of creativity and productivity, Vasari gives us a very, very misleading picture of the elderly Leonardo. Because Vasari didn't ever know Leonardo.
Exactly.
And so he just says, oh, when he went to Rome, he was in his 60s, and he just played games. He made these strange monsters that were made out of intestines, and he blew them up, and he found a little lizard and put a beard on it. When Domenico Lorenza here and I and others have started to look much more seriously at what is he doing in his 60s, he is trying to drain the Pontine marshes. He is designing palaces for the Medici. He is busy still working on the Mona Lisa since Altro, because it's there, it's in his place. So we do need to be careful that even that kind of view that there's going to be an inevitable decline doesn't get in our way of appreciating.
And in fact, arguably the grandest project he ever undertook, he undertook in the last year or two of his life, and that was the construction of the Palace of Romorantin in the Loire Valley. And Francis I was going to have him build this enormous palace and then reconfigure the town. And that was, if Leonardo had lived maybe another 10 years, the capital of France would not be Paris, it would be Romorantin, and it would have been constructed by Leonardo da Vinci. Sadly, of course, he died, but they had actually, it's recently been discovered, the work actually began on it. And I think one of Leonardo's greatest regrets at the end of his life is that he didn't have a he didn't have a building to his name. People sometimes ask me, what would he be doing if he were alive today? Would he be in Silicon Valley or something? I'm sure he would be an architect, because he was desperate to build palaces and churches and things like that. And it looked at the end of his life, or he didn't know it was the end of his life when he went to France in his mid-60s, but I'm sure what drew him there was the prospect of designing this enormous palace and effectively creating the new capital of France.
Thinking more generally about the nature of the human mind, the nature of genius, the nature of creativity, are there other lessons from his life and accomplishments that we haven't discussed that you think are particularly related?
For me, there's something about Leonardo that really inspires me, in that he's so optimistic. And there's different kinds of geniuses. There are brooding geniuses like this Michelangelo person. There are other people who cut off their ears. But for me, Leonardo has this great, I find him so affirming, because he's just always there looking, believing firmly that he's going to find a better way, a solution. And he has confidence that nature provides him with that model, and it is there waiting to be revealed. A lovely sort of feeling, and I happen to be a Pollyanna, so I love having an optimistic Leonardo.
Phil?
I find very encouraging. One of the real things about being an academic is serendipity. You don't realize how much of what you do in life is accidental. You think it's more systematic, but actually doing academics is like browsing in the library, and you never know that the volume next to the one you're looking for is really the one you really need. And that's really what Leonardo teaches us, is that the thing that you're thinking you're working on is really what leads to something else. And every one of his pages, you just see his mind moving from one idea to the next. And it's really kind of encouraging and liberating to realize that it's all right to allow your mind to wander at times, that this is really kind of a serendipity, and imagination is really something that's okay. It's really exciting, and it's a valuable exercise.
One of the projects he didn't get to construct, sadly, is the bridge that he was going to build for the Sultan across the Bosporus. And I think that is in many ways symbolic of what he tried to do throughout the course of his career, that he was always building bridges. He was building bridges between disciplines, as we've heard, multiple times in multiple ways. But he was also building bridges between people and cultures, because he went from the culture of Florence to the court of Milan. He went to France. He went to the court of the Pope Leo X. And he had these contacts with the Islamic world as well, which were intellectual in terms of, as Martin was showing us last hour, looking at things like Alhazen and also Avicenna and Averroes. He also looked at these great Muslim scholars. And so he was always trying to make these links between and among things. And I think, and maybe this goes back to your question, Elliot, about community, that he desperately valued community and was always seeking people out. Walter, yesterday or the day before, was mentioning that wonderful catalog of questions that he has, where he says, ask so-and-so how they go on the ice on Flanders. And he wanted to know everything. He wanted to seek these people out and discover how things were done elsewhere. And as Gary said, how things then could be made better where we are. He wanted to improve our lives. He wanted to improve the lives of the wool merchants in Florence by making a machine that would create something like 1,000 needles an hour for them. Mm-hmm. And so everything could be bettered. And so it is this sort of relentless optimism and the ability to make these bridges between people and between concepts.
And while he didn't get his treatises published, he has this list of, I'm going to write a treatise on this and this and this. And why do you do that? Because you want to share it with other people. He does believe that knowledge is something that has to be shared. It's not just solely for personal gratification.
So what lessons are there? What kinds of things can we do to perhaps encourage, inspire more Leonardo-like thinking today?
Wow, look at what we're doing.
This is good.
I mean, I love the idea that we're sort of still making Leonardos. We have little machines all around us.
Yeah.
We're making Leonardo for him. We're finishing off his thing. And we mentioned the bridge here. Ross mentioned the bridge. The Norwegians actually built the bridge. So we're actually kind of finishing Leonardo 500 years later. We're sort of still making the Leonardo for him. You know, so his ideas are not dead. They're still very much alive in us. I think that's incredibly encouraging that those ideas that he was thinking about are still vital enough that we want to keep tinkering with them.
Personally, I'd really like to see that our educational system was more, we paid more attention to being out in nature. It is something that we increasingly are divorced from. I mean, I'm sure you've all read in the New York Times about forest therapy, where we're all supposed to go out, and if we go into a forest, we'll become calmer, we'll become better people. I mean, there are physiological studies of this now. And of course, it would be much more than that. But as our world gets increasingly virtual and artificial, to have these kinds of opportunities, to be in an Aspen, or certainly especially for inner city kids, for people who live in tough urban environments, to be able to have time to quietly enjoy listening to that lovely little stream that goes around the campus.
Well, actually, a number of us did this the last 2 days.
Oh, you did that?
Thanks to Elliot.
Where we actually went out with quotations from Leonardo and took a walk through the forest. So I think we'll share all those quotes with you so you can perhaps do the same thing. You know, I'm just thinking about this, about how we can get more Leonardos. And I'm just thinking, and I'm embarrassed to say this as I'm sitting here on the stage with 3 other men. And I mean, I think of Virginia Woolf inventing a sister of Shakespeare, Judith, I think it was. Leonardo, as I recall, you're the experts, had no full sister, but he had a number of half-sisters because his father, I think, had a 3rd and 4th wife with children. The 1st and 2nd wife had no children. And couldn't one create far more genius in the world simply by providing education, the same education and opportunity to women? And you just think of all the Leonardos, perhaps his sisters, who never, ever had any opportunity to express the same genius that they presumably were born with that Leonardo did.
And for us to be sensitive too, as historians, as increasingly is being the case, to say, okay, a woman in the Renaissance has more limited opportunities, but where's the genius in embroidery? Where's the genius in the way that nuns organized their lives within those convents and took responsibility, as many of the accounts show us, for actually paying and keeping accounts, that there are genius within the circumstance that you're given. And if we don't recognize that, then we are not only not providing the opportunity in the first place, but we're not recognizing how creative people can be within the kind of restricted worlds they sometimes have to live in.
Incredible music in the monastery, in the nunneries, in the convents, absolutely.
And one of the interesting stories in Florence in the 1470s, the very first printing press in Florence was 1471. It quickly, as so many printing presses did in 1471-72, went bankrupt because they were simply producing more books than there were readers. But by 1476, a new one started at a monastery in Florence, and the compositors were nuns. And in 1481, those nuns put together the first edition of the translations of Plato by Marsilio Ficino. And so they were, Martin described very graphically the difficult lot of a woman in 15th century Italy, and that you can go across Europe with that. The model was much the same. And in some ways, you were better off if you ended up in a nunnery because you could have, or if you married Lodovico Sforza, because his wife Beatrice was very accomplished. There were many accomplished women in the 15th century, and they're being celebrated more and more these days. The wife of Federico da Montefeltro was one of the most educated and intelligent women of the time, but unfortunately had to give birth to 7 children in 8 years and died after giving birth to the last one. And so there were all sorts of things stacked against them, biologically, culturally, socially, etc.
So get thee to a nunnery, go.
Yeah.
So questions from the audience, please, for any of our panelists,
Way in the back.
right here,
in the back.
and
So this is a general question in thinking about contemporary times and how we are multitasking. Do we know much about how Leonardo or Michelangelo as well actually worked? So were they totally focused on one task at a time, or was he multitasking?
Well, I know a lot about Michelangelo.
Let's try there.
No, he doing 25 tasks, multiple tasks all the time. We wouldn't even call it multiple tasking. He just never slept.
Yeah.
And that generally was the profile of
Yeah, of any craftsman in the Renaissance, I think that had just multiple projects going simultaneously, which partly explains the unfinished nature of many projects. They just had so many things going simultaneously that you couldn't carry out everything.
And yet I'm interested about your question in terms of what we mean by multitasking. These people are doing many things, but they're not looking at their phone, driving,
Exactly,
and trying to think great thoughts. I think that's the problem, that we have now developed a culture that allows us to do a false multitasking. That these people did do many things.
Linda has a question, and then Stefan at the same table.
So I haven't heard a good explanation of why Leonardo wrote in Mirror Vision. I know he did and that it was popular, but what was the real reason he did it?
Can I take this one because I'm left-handed? And the answer is very simple. It was, in the first place, it was not a code, as it is so often, because what worse code can you possibly think of than, oh, here's a document, I wonder what it says. Let me hold it up to a mirror. In fact, and you crack, it's the easiest code to crack. In fact, Leonardo did occasionally use code in his writing. When he was working on the Sforza horse, he was, for the ingredients for the way he was going to mix the bronze, he didn't want anyone to know this, so he began using signs of the zodiac for the various components of it. And sometimes he would actually write a word backwards. So when he referred to the horse, he would, for the cavallo, he would write O-L-L, whatever, which is, when you write it backwards, it's actually legible forwards. So he wasn't a great code maker. It was simply because, and I'm left-handed, and when you have to, as a left-hander, you have to make a decision. Do I do the Obama, and do you go over, or do you go under? Because if you go straight across, you end up with the ink all over your hand. You smear the ink. And it's a much easier, this is an awkward gesture for a left-hander. If you're right-handed, try doing that. Imagine if you had to write like that rather than pulling the pen. The fascinating thing is when he started doing this. He couldn't have done it at school. The first bit of handwriting we have from Leonardo is 1473 when he was 21 years old, August of 1473. The beautiful landscape drawing he did of the Arno Valley, and on the back in his backwards handwriting, he dates it. The date of Our Lady of the Snows, August 5th, 1473, sono contento. So he enjoyed, I'm happy, so he was content being out in the countryside. So by 21, he was writing backwards, and he was not just experimenting at that stage. That's just, I think, the way his brain worked. And he obviously had a very unique brain, not just in terms of being able to flip things back and forth like writing. He could obviously read forwards, and he could write forwards, because there are a number of examples where he's writing forwards. But his brain was such that, probably unprecedented in history in terms of his ability to take an object and turn it around in his head. Yeah. You saw, I can't remember who it was now, who showed the polyhedrons that he did with Luca Pacioli, and the way he spun those around and he could fill them in. There's no one else in history, I think, who could have done that, which is why he would have made such a wonderful architect if he had been given a commission that he was able to carry through. Yeah. But the answer is very simple in terms of
Stefan?
I have a specific question. It has to do when you talked about him opening the heart of the pig and looking at Galen. So was Galen writing in Latin, Greek, or Arabic? And could he read it in those languages?
No.
And did he also think of, those were the days of the four humors, right?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Did he ever consider himself as a healer, relate to medicine, healing people?
You want me to take it? Yeah, sure. First of all, Galen, originally in Latin, but he was so popular with so many translations, Leonardo could have read him in Italian. No chance that Leonardo could read Arabic. Very few people in Italy could at that time. In terms of healing, Leonardo had a lot of advice about health. One of the things he said is never, if you need to go to the bathroom, don't hold it, go immediately. And he described how you should
Genius.
chew your food a lot. Interesting, you mentioned the four humors. Leonardo believed in the four humors. We want to bring him forward to our time and see him as someone who's 20th century or someone who's 21st century. The greatest historian of science of the 20th century was George Sarton, and his 4,000-page history of science, he died just as he was getting to Leonardo. But Leonardo was the genesis of it, because he was asked to give a lecture on Leonardo's science after all of these manuscripts were published finally after 1900, or just before 1900. And he realized he couldn't write about Leonardo's science without understanding medieval science and philosophy. And so he wrote 4,000 pages on that. And he makes it very obvious that Leonardo, you can find in Leonardo references to the four humors. And if you look at what Martin was showing us last hour about the microcosm and the macrocosm of the universe, microcosm of the body, that is not a metaphor for Leonardo. As you can see from that, he's trying to work out how all of it works. He is deadly serious. He says at one point, the ancients call man a little world. And he doesn't put what we might expect the modern Leonardo to put. That's complete nonsense. He then spends 30 years trying to find the Codex Leicester, which Martin is working on with Domenico right now, is full of ideas about the macrocosm and the microcosm, and that he's trying to find out how the circulation of the body is like the circulation of the rivers on the earth. And we know that's complete nonsense, but Leonardo 100% accepted it. Mm-hmm. So he wouldn't have made a good doctor for us today.
I think we just have time for one question. Lori?
Not a soft football, but a softball question. Do you know where the Mona Lisa, can you trace where it was over the past 500 years before it got to the museum?
Yes, we can. I mean, that's what's so fascinating. In fact, I think that should be Ross's next book. What Mona Lisa has seen. I mean, she was in the French royal collection. She was in Napoleon's bedroom. She was stolen and taken out of the Louvre. So there are very pretty decent understanding of the provenance of that painting as it's passed first from Leonardo to...
well conserved, all
Well,
Who knows? Yeah.
I mean, the Louvre is the first, great great public collection. So the Mona Lisa becomes the first sort of great major art object which is one of the reasons why it sort of rose to the top and became the world's most famous painting, because it became the obligation of the great, the tour of English gentlemen to stop at the Louvre, because everybody could stop at the Louvre. And then it was the first painting stolen in 1911,
Right,
and so it
that's
became a cause célèbre, and everybody heard about it, and became, the first public relations event.
I would like to thank these three wonderful panelists for not just this, but everything else they've done.
Thanks to you.
you.
Thanks to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.